Thank you very much to KPMG for having me, such a lovely group of people, and I get to come to Ireland. I am, though, a little amazed to be invited this year because we already have an economist on the stage, and adding a second economist to a breakfast event, I'm astounded because economics has been defined as the subject of telling you things you've known your whole life, but in a language you can't understand. So what I would like to do is really to, in the next 15 minutes or so, I think take you through what globally inflation and therefore what interest rates in the Eurozone might look like in the next few years. I then want to touch on the global economic outlook, specifically what's happening with the major economies of the US and China, and again, what that could mean for Ireland. And then I'm going to finish with a look at where technology could be headed. What are some of the exciting changes around AI that could also be influencing the future? Okay, I'm going to give you a lot of caveats when I look to the future, and this is the first one, which is when I talk about where interest rates might head, I want you to remember the quote by the great economist J.K. Galbraith, who said, "The sole function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable." But we all have to plan. So, looking at global inflationary pressures, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which does a semi-annual forecast, they just came out with their forecast yesterday, but it doesn't take into account what happened in Israel over the weekend. And that supply-side shock is going to potentially influence where inflation and therefore interest rates will head. And the tragic events over the last few days has an unfortunate historical echo, which is the 1973-74 Yom Kippur War. That was the first of two supply-side energy shocks in the 1970s. The second was the Iran-Iraq War of 1979. Those two shocks put together led to an era of stagflation, where you had high inflation and a stagnant economy. So, could we be seeing a similar outcome today? Now, I want you to also bear in mind the observation of Mark Twain, the writer, who said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So what will happen today will not exactly be what happened in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And just a reminder about what happened then, that was a period where you had double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, and a global recession. And the global recession came about because to bring down inflation, interest rates shot up, and the Volcker shock triggered a global recession. Central banks today target inflation of around 2%. Back then, they didn't have inflation targeting. And we have seen through the Russia-Ukraine war, and that shock from February of last year led to the first energy supply-side shock since the 1970s. Inflation didn't rise as high, unemployment didn't shoot up, but we're now faced with a second shock. And whether or not Iran is implicated, whether or not the uncertainty in the Middle East starts to fuel those energy prices, adding on to the commodity prices from the Russia-Ukraine war, which are still feeding through, I think these things may well shift monetary policy as this begins to sink in. So right now, the ECB has roughly signaled that rates may stay at 4%, that it's peaked. This is what the Fed, the Bank of England have all signaled. But I think the events of the last few days makes us realize monetary policy has done better than the early 1980s. But there is still, I think, a lot of uncertainty about what it will look like going ahead. Historically, in 100 inflationary episodes since 1970 around the world, it takes 3 years for inflation to feed through. And so we're about a year or so, and I'm afraid there is still more to come. But as I say, it is hugely uncertain what this latest episode will mean. And just to give an indication of how uncertain this year has been, when Christine Lagarde, the ECB president, was asked, is this it for interest rates? Have they peaked? She said, it's a definite maybe. And yet it's kind of accurate, I thought. I now want to move on to what the global economic outlook looks like in a broader sense. What's happening with growth? So I'm going to start with China, because the slowdown in China and the high interest rate environment, that combination in lots of markets has begun to suggest we could have a financial accident where, because yields, which is the cost of borrowing, has risen, bond prices have collapsed in a number of markets, including treasuries. Now, in China, this combination of high inflation, stagnant growth is coming on the back of a highly leveraged property sector, which is under stress. And the news flow is the biggest property developer that's listed may well be defaulting on its bonds. So my latest book is called, in a very cheery title, The Great Crashes. When economists say great, they mean the opposite. So when I was a young economist, I was given this advice. If you're going to forecast something, either forecast the event or the timing, but never both. So the next great crash in my book is China. I don't know when. Oh, I should have said this at the beginning. Nothing I say should be relied upon for investment advice. But China is unusual in that it's never had a great crash. Every economy has booms and busts. You may be wondering, China could have a crash and we wouldn't know about it. You would be wise. That is very true. But if it were to have a great crash, that would have huge implications. And I think we can discuss it a bit more in the interest of time. But let me just say, should China have a great crash, just bear in mind, it won't be limited to China, because China is the biggest official lender in the world. It lends to 175 out of 185 lending jurisdictions. It's bigger than the World Bank, the IMF, the Paris Club of 22 advanced economies. It would be a great crash if China had a crash. Now let me take you to the other driver of growth, which is the United States. You might have heard there is an election coming up next year. So a Washington insider said to me, we are one Biden fall away from another Trump administration. So what does this mean for geopolitics, for US-China relations, for global growth? There's a number of things. One, of course, is a number of Republicans don't support the ESG or sustainability agenda. The support for Ukraine, the support for the current NATO and geopolitical setup, that may also change if there was a Republican administration. Trump, of course, may not be the Republican candidate, although it looks likely. Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor who's been running as well, a Washington insider described him to me as Trump without the crazy. So, but the one thing both Republicans and Democrats agree on is their China policy. So it's very likely that whoever comes in next year, the same tensions that we see in the great power competition, which is what this era is. It is competition between US and China and everyone else being affected by that. It's not about trade. It's not even really about chips and tech. It's about power. And this is the era in which I think we are looking at, regardless of what happens in the US. How does this affect Ireland? How does it affect Europe? Europe is becoming the beneficiary of this. So in other words, as the semiconductor chip company, the Taiwanese one, their suppliers are looking to set up in Europe. It's because they're looking for neutral ground, as it were, in order to maintain global growth and global supply chains. So the supply chain impact, I think, could actually benefit Europe. There are already signs of it, and benefit Ireland as well. I don't want you to leave you with a gloomy note about US-China relations, because the politics are not good. But when it matters, the US and China have actually come to the table. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, recently had a massive breakthrough. Both the US and China and other countries agreed on a set of rules to open up the services sector globally. And this is a huge advance. So you might be thinking, hang on, how did the US and China both come to the table for this? Well, the answer is they understand the old adage, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So when it matters to set global rules, global standards, they have come to the table. I now want to spend my last few minutes looking ahead to what I think of as we could be on the cusp of an age of disruption, where technologies actually do transform businesses. So I'm going to ask for a show of hands to illustrate what I'm talking about. So how many of you used Zoom in 2019 before the pandemic? Raise your hand if you did. Okay, so a few people. How many of you use Zoom now? So I had never heard of Zoom in 2019, even though I chair an investment company that only invests in private growth companies. Remember, nothing I say should be relied upon for investment. But the reason I use this example is the technology was there, but we didn't use it. And this is called the Solow paradox, named after the great economist Robert Solow, who observed, in this computer age, we are surrounded by technology. You can see it everywhere, except in the productivity data. So why is that? Oh, by the way, he also said, the difference between giving his secretary a computer is that before she had one, she worked for him, and now he works for her. It's because we didn't use the technology. There was only one period in history, in the last 40 years, which was in the late 1990s, in the United States, productivity rose. That was it. Did not rise in Europe, has not risen since, did not rise before. What was the difference? Technology was used, just like we're now using Zoom. Telephone and Zoom, they don't work if you're the only one who has a telephone. So my husband has an old Nokia phone, and he has great battery life. And he always tells me, during the apocalypse, I'm going to be the only one who has a phone that works. And I said, well, who are you going to call? So it's that change in behavior that makes technology transformative, that makes disruption real. And I think we're just on the cusp because of behavioral changes. We're beginning to see that. And if we could use this technology to help with the green transition, assist with hybrid working, these are the kinds of changes which could transform society, economies, and of course, firm productivity. And to me, it's the quality of growth going forward that could be positively impacted so long as we use the technology that's there. And during difficult times, and this is a lesson from history I also write about in my book, it's very easy to cut back on things that seem superfluous, like technology, human resource training on IT. And yet, it's investing in these things that means you will do well coming out of a down cycle. So in a down cycle, when valuations are cheaper, the market is depressed, the tendency, I think, is to watch the bottom line. But I think the lesson from history is you should also focus on investing in what's going to transform and looking at generative AI, looking at, as I say, technologies that are there beginning to be used. I'm actually very hopeful we're entering an age in which we will finally answer the Solow paradox and actually use the technology to better our lives, your firm performance, and then, of course, the Irish economy as a result as well. So Thank you very much for listening to the second Economist of the morning. And I know we're going to hear from Camilla, and then I look forward to hearing your thoughts, observations, and reflections. Thank you.